Hello, everyone. Hi, can you hear me? Hi. Welcome back. It's really nice to have you back. I'm Michael Brenner, Director of the Center for Israel Studies. I think I see a lot of familiar faces and students, lots of students who had just taken their midterms today, and they still come. That's maybe a good sign. I heard from a few people that this is actually their very first event they attend after um, about 3 years, for about 3 years, and it is our first event we are having here. Well, it's our first event in person with an in-person panel, I should say, and it's really a pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of the Center for Israel Studies. As you know, or some of you know, with a slightly changed agenda as originally planned. Originally, Professor Pnina Lahav was supposed to be here tonight and talk about her new biography on Golda Meir. So if you come out and see among the books a book on Golda Meir, you might be surprised. But that was the original plan for tonight. And unfortunately, due to a sudden loss in her family, she had to cancel for tonight. But we will bring her next year. And in the meantime, please remember also those of you who registered for the lecture, you can still watch the Golda documentary. It's still available until tomorrow online. So this was supposed to be the actual Sonnenschein lecture for this year. And my very special welcome go to Helen and Dan Sonnenschein. Maybe let us consider this a bonus night for the Sonnenschein lecture. The actual lecture will take place in 2023. And speaking about supporters, as always, it's a pleasure to welcome Lillian Abenson, whose presence is always an inspiration. I did not want to cancel this event tonight, originally, as we had made quite a lot of preparations. And when I was quite desperate, it was actually my wife and colleague, Michelle Engert, who came up with the idea of why don't you change the plan and have an event that was supposed to take place later tonight? And that saved our evening, so thank you. And I'm very grateful to my co-panelists, Chris Edelson and Cynthia Miller-Idriss, that they were able to switch our event on a short-term basis so we can have the discussion here tonight. And last but certainly not least, many thanks to Laura Cutler, who is in the back for having worked very hard, especially hard this time, to make all the changes work last minute for tonight. And I would also like to thank our partners, co-sponsors for tonight's event, the Center for Israel Studies, the Jewish Studies Program, the History Department, the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies, and the Polarization and Extremism Research Lab of the School of Public Affairs. And I'm also very glad we have really such a great turnout here in person tonight. There is also another group joining us, and I hope they can all see and hear us over Zoom tonight as virtual guests. And let me remind you, those who follow us on Zoom, that there is closed captioning at the bottom of your screen throughout the entire event, and that there will be an audience Q&A discussion afterwards. And if you're following on Zoom, you can put your questions in the on your computer in the Q&A function. If you're here, don't put it on your computers, raise your hand. Actually, you have to come, I think, to the front, but we'll see that later. You will also have the opportunity to buy books afterwards. And it is now my pleasure to pass on to my dear colleague and co-organizer of this event, Professor Pamela Nidal, the Patrick Clendenin Chair in Women's and Gender History and Director of the Jewish Studies Program, who will introduce our panel and moderate our discussion.
Great. Thanks, Michael. Just get over here. All right. Well, good evening, everyone. So great. Let me grab this so you'll be able to hear me. It's so great to be here and see so many people and see a room full. It is really quite exciting. So I have the wonderful privilege of moderating this evening's panel. And on Is Democracy in the United States Endangered? Lessons from Weimar Germany. And first, let me introduce our panelists. I will start with Chris Edelson, who is all the way at the end, as far away from me, most far away. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Government. His teaching and research interests focus on presidential national security power under the U.S. Constitution. His first book, Emergency Presidential Power, From the Drafting of the Constitution to the War on Terror, was published by the University of Wisconsin Press in fall 2013. And his second book, Power Without Constraint, The Post 9/11 Presidency and National Security, came out in 2016. I'm going to introduce then Michael Brenner, whom I think almost everybody knows. Michael is the Seymour and Lillian Abinson Chair in Israel Studies and Director of American University's Center for Israel Studies. He's a distinguished professor in the AU History Department, and he is also the Chair of Jewish History and Culture at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. He serves as the international president of the Leo Baeck Institute, and he is the author of 9 books translated into 10 languages. His latest book, In Hitler's Munich, Jews, the Revolution, and the Rise of Nazism, deals with the rise of political extremism in post-World War I Munich. And Cynthia Miller-Idriss is a sociologist and professor in the School of Public Affairs and the School of Education here at AU. And she runs the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab. She has testified several times before the US Congress. She regularly briefs policy, security, education, and intelligence agencies in the United States, the United Nations, and other countries on trends in domestic and violent terrorism and strategies for preventing it and disengagement. She is the author, co-author, or co-editor of 6 academic books, including her most recent book, which is Hate in the Homeland, The New Global Far Right, published by Princeton. And the books will be available, all their books will be available for purchase afterwards. So the way we're going to do this, I'm going to actually have a conversation, and all of us are going to have a conversation, but we're going to start where I think it makes the most sense to start, which is to start with the Weimar Republic and to start with Professor Brenner. So, Michael, do you want to kind of give us an overview into what are what the political crisis that happened in Munich that you wrote about so evocatively in Hitler's Munich?
Sure. Is this on? Can you hear me? No. Okay. Now, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Pam. Where to start? Well, the first thing I should say is when I wrote the book, I wrote it in German actually, and it was translated. And my translator Jeremiah Weimar, my wonderful translator, is here actually. And when I wrote it in German first I wrote it during 2018, came out in 2019. I did not really think so much of that we would have a panel like that about America. I mean, sure, Trump was already president, but it was before January 6th and all that came afterwards. And when the English translation came out this year, I was really scared about some parallels that I saw. So the book is Munich after World War I. And why Munich? Well, Munich was more than just a city in Germany. It was the city where the Nazi movement started. It was the city where Hitler lived. It was the city where he first tried to come to power. And he tried to come to power through a coup, through the infamous beer hall putsch of 1923. So the book covers the period of post-war Munich. How did this person, Adolf Hitler, become, first of all, a politician, and then somebody about whom Thomas Mann, the famous German writer and Nobel Prize winner, said already in early 1923, before the coup, He said Munich is the city of Hitler. So he was the kind of dominant figure without having any office there. How did this happen? And what I was interested in the book was, and what about the Jewish community of Munich? What about the Jews of Munich? And here's the almost paradox and also fascinating fact. And the first half of the book deals with the revolution. So when the monarchy came down in November 1918, a prime minister now ruled over Bavaria. Munich was the capital of Bavaria. And it was a Berlin-born socialist Jew, Kurt Eisner, a journalist, a moderate socialist, not a radical, no communist. So here you go within a short time span from the first Jewish head of state ever in Germany, and by the way, basically also the last one. I mean, it's a tiny little exception, and to the city of Hitler in nothing. After 3 months in office, this Kurt Eisner, the prime minister of Bavaria, I mean, in America, we might say governor because Bavaria, of course, was part of Germany, but they still call it prime minister, was assassinated. And also because he was a Jew and because he was left-wing. And when I looked at the at all the facts, it's really interesting that you see Jewish history on all sides of this. Of course, there were a lot of other revolutionaries who happened to be Jewish in that time, but also on the other side, you have people on Jewish background. Well, in fact, the assassin of this person, of Kurt Eisner, was a Count von Arco. On his father's side, it was an old Bavarian, Austrian aristocratic family. On his mother's side, she was a née Oppenheim from an old Jewish family that had long been already converted. But this young assassin of the Bavarian Jewish prime minister felt very nationalist and wanted to be accepted in one of those very radical nationalist associations, but they wouldn't accept him because of his partially Jewish background. So paradoxically, or tragically, the fact that the Jewish prime minister was assassinated by somebody who had, a remote Jewish background had also to do with the fact that he wanted to prove to his right-wing comrades that he could be part of them, so he could finally be accepted. These are just all little, I mean, there's a lot of little stories. I want to go into detail. What I think, if I may take a couple of minutes to talk about the rise of Hitler and in the end the demise of the Weimar Republic, as it was called after the city of Weimar. Munich was definitely the center of the reactionary right-wing rejection of the republic that was founded in 1918, but the anti-democratic sentiment spread to Berlin and to other parts of the German Reich. And in my view, I would say there are 5 reasons. Of course, you can always discuss what brings democracy down, but there are 5 reasons, and if I talk about them very briefly, they may also be a bridge to what we talk afterwards. There was definitely this, it was a time of crisis, social and economic crisis. Germany had political crisis. Germany had lost World War I. There was hyperinflation in the early 1920s. All of, always a economic crisis, a social and political crisis, of course, is a very good ground for the rise of authoritarian movements. So that is obvious that was the case. There was also delegitimation of democratic structures and of democratically elected politicians like Eisner and others who were rejected by not just the extreme right wing, like the rising a Nazi party, which was not founded yet then. And if you look at it, we just talked about it, you mentioned even the birther myth is there. Kurt Eisner was always characterized not just as a Jew, that wasn't enough, as an East European Jew, a Galicianer, a Galician Jew, which was a total lie. He was born in Berlin. His name, and that was not just the circles around his assassin and later Hitler. It was the papal nuncio, the papal like ambassador, who, by the way, became later Pope Pius. He was then Nuncius Pacelli in Munich. It was the conservative Bavarian government. And they called him, they said his real name is not Eisner, it's Kosmanowski, and he was born in Poland, or whatever was then the Austrian Empire. So that's a delegitimation. It's not enough he was Jewish, not enough he was socialist, not enough he was Prussian in Bavaria. He also had to be a foreigner and not be born in Germany. There was also a very prominent conspiracy theory, the stab in the back legend. And the stab in the back legend said, of course, Germany could not have lost the war, because how could German soldiers lose a war? They're so strong. It was the enemy in our midst, and it was the Jews and the left wing, the socialists. And if they were Jews and left wing, okay, that was the worst. So it was a delegitimation of a whole groups of German society. Of course, political polarization, violence were other elements. And I'm talking now about the early 20s, but if we get to the late 20s and especially early 1930s, we see all of this playing out in all of Germany. We see street fighting between communists and the Nazis. We have this polarization going on. There is also the weakness of what we might call the gatekeepers of democracy. And again, I think we see it I just looked at Bavaria in the early 1920s, but there we see it play out very, very early. What we see later in all of Germany, who are the gatekeepers? Well, a lot of different institutions. But if you look at the judiciary, for example, the judges, as already people said back then, they were blind on their right eye. So if you were left-wing extremist, you could get a very harsh sentence, early on, even death sentences. If you were a right-wing extremist, like the assassin of the Bavarian prime minister, or later Adolf Hitler trying the insurrection, you were a patriot. And they both, by the way, it was the same judge who presided over the trial of Arco, the assassin of the prime minister, and later over Hitler, after he tried to come to power in this beer hall putsch. I don't want to go into detail, it's kind of complicated, but it's the same judge. And Hitler basically serves a prison sentence of 9 months for an insurrection which people died, in which people rallied in the streets of Munich to overthrow the Bavarian government. And finally, they wanted to march to Berlin like Mussolini had done with his march to Rome and Italy. And what I found interesting is that it's not just of course, his defender would say he is a hero and a patriot, and the judge said it, but it's even the prosecutor who said it, which was really interesting. So the justice system is very much favoring them, and I wouldn't even call it a prison sentence that Hitler served after trying to overthrow the government. I would call it like a writer's retreat. If you see the pictures, how he was dressed, and he had all of his friends visiting him, Rudolf Hess and Goering, all of those, his early friends, and he wrote Mein Kampf during this year, his political statement. So all of, and I could go on with other institutions. The police, especially in Munich, was very early on infiltrated by the Nazis. And so all of, and the government, the politicians, which were not in any way friends of Hitler and his party, they thought he could be helpful to them. And that brings me to the fifth point, and which I think is the most important point, and which I think in most cases where democracy is threatened is the crucial point. And those are the enablers. Those are the people who know better, but helped an authoritarian movement to come to power. And now I'm jumping to 1933, because there you see it most clearly. When Hitler finally came to power, it wasn't through an insurrection. Now we're 10 years later. 1923 was the beer hall insurrection or putsch. In 1933, he was appointed by the aged president. President was more of a symbolic figure in Germany. Hindenburg, World War I hero Hindenburg, as chancellor. In a total legal way. It was not against the German constitution. There were cases when there was no majority of parties forming a coalition in the German parliament, the Reichstag, that the president would appoint the chancellor. It happened before, happened in January 30th, 1933. But what is fascinating here is it wouldn't have happened without people who were conservative politicians in Germany, who already in the early 1920s had backed him in Munich, and who would now say, he is our chance. He's our chance to come back to power or to stay in power. And we will, and that was the word they often used, we will be able to contain him. And in fact, if you look at his first government, there's almost no other, there are almost no Nazi. There's Goering and there is Frick, who actually was a Munich police chief earlier. These are the three Nazi in the government. All the others are conservative politicians in the beginning. There's von Papen and others who were no Nazis, who actually despised Hitler as an authoritarian, as a low, he came from he was nothing. He was not even an officer, or high-ranking officer in World War I. And they thought, he will help us to come back to power. But of course, we know it happened actually very different. So I would say these 5 points, this social and economic crisis, the delegitimation of democratic structures, the polarization, political polarization, violence, street violence, the weakness of the gatekeepers of democracy, justice system, also the media, the political elite, and the enablers were the things that helped Hitler to come to power in a totally legal way. And he didn't make a secret. He always said, I will come to power according to the German constitution, and that will, and I will use my power to abolish the democracy and the republic. So that was a little longer than I thought.
Well, that was, first of all, that was excellent. Also very chilling to think about some of the parallels. So historians don't believe that history repeats itself, but I'm going to turn to Chris and ask him to give us some insights into differences, parallels for, now essentially a century later and in a different country.
Thank you. Thanks. Nice to be with everyone. So yes, that's what I'm thinking as I'm reading Michael's book and listening to what he says. Michael says at the beginning of his book, history does not repeat, but it does rhyme. It's important to be precise about this, though. Donald Trump is not Adolf Hitler. And I think that can be a problem. There are some really striking parallels that Michael mentioned that I see in the book, some of which I didn't know about. This birther point is rather astounding. He's not Adolf Hitler. Nobody is precisely the same. That can help someone who's an authoritarian, though, because then they can always say, well, I'm not Hitler, so I can't be all that dangerous. I remember during the 2016 campaign, Donald Trump's daughter, one of his daughters, Ivanka Trump, was asked about this. She was asked, about comparing her father to Hitler, and she rather indignantly said, "My father, no, of course he's not Hitler." And even I, at the time, was concerned about what I saw as authoritarian tendencies from Donald Trump, but I thought, oh, of course he's not. Yes, it's ridiculous to say that. He's not identical, but the warning signs and some of the similarities are chilling indeed. I want to mention a few of them, make some of the comparisons. The central point I would take away, though, is that on one level, Donald Trump does not have to be Hitler to be a danger. Most authoritarians are not totalitarians like Hitler was, but they still can destroy democracy. And that's the central threat I see from Donald Trump, is that he's a threat to democracy. Some of the ways in which we can see that involve parallels to the story in Germany. I'll mention a few of them, some of them Michael mentioned as well. One is this birther point. It's really rather amazing to see. To me, I didn't know this story. This man, Kurt Eisner, this first Jewish head of state in Germany, who is described falsely as being not from Germany at all, despite the fact that he's born in Berlin. And of course, that makes me think, I'm reading this, I'm thinking, that's what we saw with Barack Obama. And of course, that's how Donald Trump came to political prominence. Donald Trump was well known before 2016. He had even had some involvement in politics. I remember in the 2012 campaign, Mitt Romney rather publicly sought his endorsement. He had become a figure in politics because of this birther point. Donald Trump was probably the most prominent birther. He talked about sending people down to Hawaii to get the real story about Barack Obama, and in fact pressured Obama to the point where Obama had to release a birth certificate. So on one level, it's striking just because it's so similar. This story, this birther story that you can see 100 years earlier. But I think it's even more important, perhaps, in our terms because of what it led to. Donald Trump. Another point Michael makes at the end of his book, he says, "Well, we can't necessarily say Hitler was able to rise because of what happened in the early 1920s," but he says, "But without these things, Hitler would not have come." I think that's the same thing with Donald Trump. We can't say Donald Trump was able to become president because Barack Obama was president, but without that, I don't think Donald Trump had the path he did. And that's a point I think is important to pay attention to. Donald Trump seizes on this birther lie, and he channels this into racial resentment against the first African-American president. And when we see the story with Hitler, the similarity there to me is that there's a lot of power in scapegoating a minority, a really incredibly small minority. I didn't know the numbers. I think 11,000 Jews in Munich, is that right? Mm-hmm. It's 2% of the population. The entire population in Germany, I think, was less than 1% Jewish. Is that right? It was very small. In Germany as a whole. So
a little less than 1%.
So you can scapegoat a very small minority and get enormous political mileage out of that. We're seeing that right now, I think, with transgender people, a very small minority in the United States. It's hard to know for sure, but the numbers I've seen, adults best estimate people is about 0.5%, and for youth it was about 1.5%. But this is a central piece. This is something that is really, in some ways, at the center of this political campaign this year. So that's something I think is worth paying attention to, how you can use this kind of energy and resentment for political gain. Another similarity I saw was, as Michael says, of course, the coup attempt. And so there are differences, of course. Hitler was actually there with a revolver, I believe, right? I mean, there's some, as Michael says, it's complicated, and some of the story is not even clear today exactly what happened, but he was there. Trump wanted to be there, apparently, based on reporting and testimony we've seen, but he didn't make it to the Capitol. But the similarity, I think, that is important for us. And again, what I'm focused on, as Michael mentioned, of course, is the danger to democracy, not whether Trump is identical to Hitler. Although I will talk about the fascism point in a minute, that is, I think, worth discussing too. But the important point I think about is the question of accountability. There was a coup attempt in 1923 in Munich. It did not succeed, and Hitler was put on trial, but he was given a very short sentence. And in fact, as Michael says, it served sort of in some, you said it was like a writer's resort, kind of a writer's community. He wrote Mein Kampf there. Donald Trump hasn't even gotten that yet. Donald Trump has not been held accountable, I don't think, in any really truly meaningful way. You could argue that he was impeached, but he wasn't, removed from office after the after the coup attempt, which I think was there was a brief moment. I don't know if people had the same feeling, but I remember watching on January 6th what's happening. And I contacted friends of mine, including one friend who had voted for Trump. And I thought, he's going to see this and he's going to say enough. My friend's reaction actually was, well, this looks like what we're seeing with Black Lives Matter. And my heart kind of sank. But I still thought, hey, the members of Congress are there. And we would see in reports even that day that members of Congress, Republicans and members of Congress, of course, were crying out for help. I thought there was a significant chance that they would remove Donald Trump from office. And in fact, some reporting suggested that maybe there was a brief, it's hard to know for sure, but maybe there was a chance. But as it turned out, the impeachment waited. It didn't happen immediately, and Donald Trump was not removed from office. So there was not accountability. That's really important. I think that's incredibly dangerous. I study presidential power in the United States, and presidential power in the United States, the story of presidential power, especially in the last 60 years or so, and even more so since 9/11, is the story of expanded power, of presidents who are able to push the limits of power, and an acquiescent Congress essentially lets them do what they want. Now, the books I've written came before Trump, and I see that as dangerous for democracy, whoever is in office. My last book focused on the George W. Bush and Barack Obama presidencies and how they both expanded presidential power. Neither was an authoritarian, though. That's what's different. When you have an authoritarian who makes clear their authoritarian goals and takes steps to actually destroy democracy through the January 6th coup attempt, when they're not held accountable, it's really difficult to see a path forward. I think it's important to think creatively about this, and I'm glad to talk more. I have an idea about this. I can talk about more. I understand it's not plausible at all. But
Can you put your mic up?
Oh, sure. So one of the lessons, I'm reading Michael's book and I'm thinking this too. One of the lessons I get from the book as well is that it is important. This might seem obvious, but it's important not to underestimate. It's important to act quickly. The whole point of the history that Michael's writing, and histories are written about authoritarians in general. There's a book called How Democracies Die. Some of what Michael's talking about is discuss the whole point of enabling and gatekeepers. These are themes they discuss there too. But the whole point of knowing this is so we can act. When we see threats, we must act. Otherwise, what's the use of it? I think it's important to think creatively. I think it's essential to think as widely as possible. My own suggestion, again, I recognize this is implausible, and I don't want to harp on it too much, but I think, in my view, we've experienced constitutional failure in the United States. We've had a clear authoritarian threat, even before. I was writing about this before January 6th, but certainly on January 6th. And when a democracy faces an authoritarian threat, that's by definition an existential threat. An authoritarian is somebody who rejects liberal democracy. It must be able to protect itself. I don't mean violently. I mean, on the day of January 6th, there was violent fighting. So you must protect yourself. What I'm thinking of is through legal mechanisms, through constitutional mechanisms. But our Constitution has failed. It did not. The remedy should have been to Donald Trump, and I still don't understand what prompted this, but Donald Trump put out some kind of social media statement on the network he has. It's called Truth. I don't know what
Social.
Truth Social. Sorry, right. So he puts out a statement where he says, I'm paraphrasing, but he says something like, I don't know why U.S. Jews don't like me. Israel really does. I could be prime minister in Israel. They love me there. And I wrote down this part because I think it's really important. He said, U.S. Jews have to act together and appreciate what they have in Israel before it's too late. So this is not the first time he said something about this. Is again, I was reading Michael's book that day. This myth, this stereotype that Jews are not loyal to the country they live in is ancient. It goes back hundreds of years. Certainly, Michael mentions in his book in the trial of this man Feckenbach. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. The idea that Jews are not loyal to the country they live in. Of course, Israel did not exist as a state then, but now that Israel does, the idea is that Donald Trump has said several times is U.S. Jews, their real country is Israel. He was speaking to a Jewish audience once, U.S. Jews, and he referred to your prime minister. He said, Mike Pence has traveled to see your prime minister. Another time he said, I can't understand how Jews can be Democrats. They're not being loyal to Israel. So that's another striking similarity too. And again, as I mentioned, a rather chilling one. But the central point I can talk more about later. I don't want to take too much time with one of you guys, Cynthia. I am not a very practical person, as you can see from my idea. Sorry, I mentioned the next step, which is even more implausible. The Constitution has failed, so there must be a new Constitution. I understand, can't happen, but I can. If people want to hear about it, I can talk about it and explain why I think it's necessary, even if it's not plausible. But the central point that I think is important to focus on is, as I say, that one thing we were talking about, we prepared for this panel, is the history with Germany in the 1930s and 40s is already written. We know tragically what happened. You read Michael's book, and there are these people, and you know what's going to happen. And you know, in the end, he very gracefully and elegantly provides sort of a description of what happens to some of the central characters, and for many of them, of course, it's what you would expect. Our history has not been written yet fully, though. We see what's happening. We see warning signs, and there are things that we can do about it. At least one hopes. And again, I think Cynthia may have more to say about this. So thanks very much.
All right, thank you. Really chilling, because one of the things that I don't think that people necessarily take into account is the role of anti-Semitism. I mean, obviously we take it into account in Hitler's in Munich, but we don't necessarily take anti-Semitism into account in terms of the threats that we're facing as a democracy today. So we're going to turn it over to Cynthia, who instead of looking way in the past or in the immediate past or present, is going to give us some ideas about the future.
Yes, thank you very much. This is on, right? You can hear me. So I wanted to say just a couple of things. I will say something about the very recent past, because at least 20, 30 years past for historians. I know that's sort of the recent past. I'm a sociologist, so for me, that's a little bit different conception of time. But I think it's really, I come at this less from a question of leadership and the impact of leadership, which is important, and we've been talking about that, but more from the perspective of why do ordinary people become so easily persuaded by propaganda, and what can we do about it, right? How do we prevent ordinary people from being so easily persuaded by propaganda or manipulated, particularly in online spaces today? It's a lot of what my lab works on. So I do want to say that what we're seeing today in what is now record-breaking hate-fueled violence across the entire spectrum. I mean, every single category last year of hate and harassment is either the highest in recorded history or broke a record, or, so you look at FBI as the most conservative numbers are the highest in 12 years, hate crimes, but the ADL's figures, the figures on Islamophobia, on anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ violence, on almost every category you look at. I know this because I was asked to speak at the White House last month, and I went and looked at the data, and I actually started writing an essay called "It's Worse Than You Think," because it was worse than I thought. And I studied this stuff. Looked at every single category, and it was worse than I thought. So that's the really bad news. But what I want to say about that is that all predates Trump by quite a lot. And so, Trump was kind of a trigger, and a lot of what's happened over the last 4 or 5 years is rooted in trends that really began at least 5 or 6 years before Trump really came onto the scene. And so we saw a record-breaking number of hate groups in 2010, which is really a reaction to Barack Obama's election, but also part of global trends that we are seeing. That was over, it topped 1,000 for the first time. Right around then, social media really kind of came on the scene and became the primary way that propaganda spreads very quickly. And at the same time, everybody who was paying attention to the violent spectrum was really not looking at all at domestic groups. And that's not at all a controversial thing to say anymore, because I think the entire infrastructure of security in the US has widely admitted that they just dropped the ball and stopped looking at domestic groups after 9/11. After 1995, Oklahoma City, there was attention, but then 9/11 happened very quickly after that, and absolutely no attention. And so really all of this kind of creeping hatred and rising violence was coming up with very little attention all the way through attacks in Oslo and Christchurch. It really took El Paso and finally Pittsburgh, I think, for people to start to really pay attention. That group of terrorist attacks is what finally started a series of hearings in Congress here in the US, one of which I testified at early on, to my own tremendous surprise, because I thought even I was a scholar of subculture. I didn't consider myself relevant to the mainstream at all. I mean, so even those of us who studied it weren't seeing it as mainstream politics or of mainstream relevance. I think we have to understand the roots of that as going back further than just the last 5 years, although certainly, of course, it's gotten worse, and in large part because of the mainstreaming and normalization of hatred that's happened through political rhetoric and partisan speech. So very quickly, one thing to know about the online world, and I'm happy to just answer any questions about this. I think the biggest difference to understand is that hateful content, whether it's anti-Semitic or anti-trans or racist content, whatever it is in no way a destination. It simply finds you wherever you are, right? Especially as a young person online. And I think any young person in the room will be able to tell us that it's just out there, and you navigate it. You encounter it and you navigate it. And if you know what it is, you look away from it and you leave it and you reject it. You may feel victimized by it, but you run into it, right? You run into it in gaming platforms. You run into it in attacks that happen in social media platforms, just regular chats. You run into it when people share Holocaust denial or minimization memes, or misogynistic and hateful memes about women, or the trans community, or whomever it is, right? We see text chains that go back and forth between teenagers. We see, things that just so readily normalize what is really dehumanizing content in the guise of jokes, right? That become like cartoons, a meme type of cartoon that is just sharing it as humor, as satire, as irony, in ways that really, I think, belittle and dehumanize. And so that's the heavy, heavy stuff to share, right? Is that it's everywhere. I think it used to be the kind of thing, I would say, it was, a manifesto you had to read, and initiation rites you had to go through and sign up for. And there are those groups still. We know the Proud Boys and other groups where they have official membership lists and initiation rites exist. But the vast majority of this is what we would call now post-organizational. It's just out there, and radicalization happens in ways that is not through formal groups. There's no single terrorist actor since 1995 and before, I think, who was a formal member of a group on the domestic side, right? So these are actors who are radicalized and mobilized to violence through the propaganda, but they're not signed up for the group, right? And so our strategies to combat it have really become very quickly outdated because they were rooted in post 9/11 strategies. So I'm going to tell you the good news now, the future, the hopeful stuff, right? Which is the good news is, and I do run a research lab, and a couple of my students are watching, I know, and one of my students here over here has been working on some of these interventions. We do design and test interventions that are meant to see whether people can be taught to recognize and reject propaganda when they see it. And the good news is they can quite easily, actually. We've done it. We do it with video-based inoculation, it's called. We do it with toolkits for parents, for coaches, for teachers, for faith community leaders. And every single intervention, we've founded 2.5 years, every single intervention we've tried so far, it's over a dozen, has worked with statistically significant results. So we know it can be done. We're now hitting this wall because we're trying to figure out, I will say, just in our lab, spinning our wheels, like, now how do we actually get these videos out in front of a lot more people, right? Like half our people have watched videos about how to fold a paper airplane. That's called a control group, right? Everybody else actually learned how to recognize propaganda and reject it. So, if we were a pharmaceutical company, we always say, like, we would go back and give the group that got the placebo, they would get the treatment effect. So now we're trying to figure out, this is our year to figure out, how do we get that intervention in front of the most amount of people? So we're working with tech companies. We're testing it in pre-roll ads. We're testing it in live spaces. We're talking to gas station companies about videos on the gas station. I mean, all kinds of things, right? But so we're behind. We're really, really behind where we need to be in terms of getting that kind of educational tools out in front of the number of people who need it. but it's not hopeless, I guess is what I would say. I think we do now know in the field, and I've briefed the White House on that. I've briefed the highest level of security agencies on that, on our results. Like, people are listening. People are really, really listening to the evidence and want to scale it up. I just wish, this were a quarter of a century ago, or at least a decade ago, 5 years ago, even. We're really, really behind. So, I'm not saying we can solve it in the next few years, but I think we're certainly better off now than where we were 3 years ago as a country and as a cluster of countries who are facing this.
Wow, really, really so powerful. But also, it's optimistic. You've got some kind of tool, but we're also about to have major midterm elections, right? And I just wonder. So even if you get these things out in gas stations and you get them out there, and also, are you going to get them to the Proud Boys?
Yeah. So our tools, two things I would say. One, they're not de-radicalization videos, right? And so what we know is that you can prevent people, just like you can with a vaccine. It's why it's called inoculation. You can prevent people from believing this stuff. You can teach them before they're exposed or before they're very far down the pathway. You can teach people to recognize and reject it. It's easy to do. We've done it in videos, like I said, as short as 30 seconds, 4-minute videos, 5-minute videos, 11-minute videos. We've tested all different lengths. 30 seconds worked. And we think it's a little bit better at 45 seconds, but 30 seconds worked. So, you can do it. You cannot de-radicalize someone that way. In fact, I know of no evidence that shows that you can de-radicalize at scale. And that's one of the scary things. You have to do it individually, one-on-one, therapeutically. It takes a long time. It takes a lot of resources. The evidence is very thin. However, I would say that, we landed on a list of backsliding democracies late last year, as many of you may know. So like any good nerdy academic, when that happened, I went and looked at the data to see like what actually happens when you land on a list of backsliding democracies. And it turns out that it takes countries about an average of 9 years to get off that list, in one way or the other, right? So either you collapse and you're no longer a democracy, or you're restored. So what I often say, because people ask, we're just asked, can you create a video before the midterms? I said, no, like we cannot make a video that's going to dissuade people from political violence in the next 13 days or whatever, it's 3 weeks. But we can get this done, I think, in 8 years, which is what we have left, according to the average data on countries on the backsliding list of democracies, to move in one direction or the other. So I think we're talking about a medium and long-term situation, and not just what do we do before November, or even what do we do before 2024. So our type of solutions are not going to be about immediate short-term crisis mitigation, but they are going to be about longer-term civic and digital literacy and work to reduce the fertile ground in which kind of hate thrives.
So I know about that list. I mean, I've read about that list, and the question is, what is the short? You gave an average, right? You gave 9 years as the average, one way or the other. What is the shortest turnaround? A, and B, what is the shortest turnaround that flipped a democracy to authoritarianism?
So there was data that came out yesterday. I don't know if anyone saw the peace index data that came out from yesterday that was not very good, that said that the US had the biggest 1-year drop in recorded history of that index, of how rapidly we dropped on what they call the scale of like peaceful societies, right? So we are sliding fast, and I don't think we have started to turn it around yet. So I'm not optimistic in the short term, but I think I would be. I mean, what else can you do except keep working at it? And I'm not hopeless either. Okay. I do think we have longer and medium-term solutions.
Yeah, I would, just remind everyone that history shows that presidents in power always lose. The parties lose the midterm elections. I mean, so whatever happens, it will actually be a reflection of that pattern of historically the parties losing the midterm elections. So I would like to give everybody a few minutes to kind of make a few more remarks before I open it up to questions. And I don't know, Chris, do you want to start and maybe react to some of the things that you've heard, or tell us a little bit more about your idea about redoing the Constitution? It's not a bad idea.
Oh, I'm glad people are interested. What Cynthia is saying obviously is much more practical, which I'm glad to hear. Yeah, so first, I think what may be helpful about this point is, even though a new constitution is not plausible, I'll tell you why I'm thinking about that. I think it's essential, as I mentioned before, to be creative when you're faced with a situation like this, because history is contingent. We don't know what's going to happen. I take that seriously, as Cynthia and Michael are both saying too. And the reason I grasp at that unlikely straw, I will say in my defense, I'm not the only one saying this. Jamel Bouie, the columnist for the New York Times, has been saying the same thing. So I thought, okay, that's a mainstream voice. And he was, in fact, he wrote a couple of pieces about this. And one of them, I'm forgetting the exact words, but he basically said, it's coming sooner than you think. I hope he's right. But the reason I'm thinking about this is because on the current path we're on, I don't see a plausible way forward for democracy. And the reason I say that is because there are, of course, only two major parties in the United States. One of them will control the White House, and they battle over control of Congress as well. Unless both of those parties are committed to democracy, I don't see how the system works. Right now, you have one that is not. And this is not, even though it sounds like a partisan observation, and in some ways, of course, it is, but strictly speaking, it's not. Whether you support democracy is not really a traditional Republican versus Democratic issue. And there are plenty of Republicans and conservatives who recognize that. And I find that without that, I would feel really lost, because I would think, oh, it's just going to be another partisan fight. It's not. There are lots of, I'll give you one example of somebody in particular who, when I saw this, it makes me think maybe there is some hope. I don't know if that's the right word, but it's striking to me. Former Congressman from Illinois, Joe Walsh. People heard of him? I think he's only in the House, I think only for one term. He does a radio show now. He was a very, very far right congressman. In fact, so far right that on election day in 2016, he posted, I think it was on Twitter, somewhere in social media. He said, I'm voting for Trump. If Clinton wins, I'm paraphrasing, but the key parts are pretty much word for word. If Clinton wins, I'm picking up a musket. Who's with me? So this was a really hardcore Trump supporter and really right-wing Republican. He's become a Trump critic, not because he's no longer a Republican or a conservative. Well, I'm not sure if he's a Republican anymore, but not because he's no longer a conservative. He certainly is. He speaks about that all the time. It's because he concluded that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy. And that's Michael mentioned before about gatekeepers and enablers. The key to preserving democracy is when you get people in the same party as the would-be authoritarian who stand up against them, who say, it's more important to me to preserve democracy than to win an election. Unfortunately, Joe Walsh is not a household name. There aren't enough people like him. I mean, Congresswoman Cheney, of course, is more well-known, but she's leaving Congress. She lost her primary. So the reason I think about this idea of a new constitution is because I don't see a path forward right now. And the idea of the new constitution would be to make the system both more liberal and more democratic. I don't mean liberal in terms of left wing. I mean liberal in terms of more accountability for government officials, better limits on power, stronger rule of law, maybe having the Department of Justice independent of the executive branch, maybe a new system for impeachment, because the current one I think is pretty much irrelevant, and making the system more democratic. Right now, of course, I mean, we saw this in 2016. You can be elected president without winning a majority of the vote, of the popular vote. You can control the Senate without having a majority of the national vote, because, of course, each state gets 2 votes. Small states are disproportionately represented. And you can have a majority if you follow the polls, which probably you shouldn't. It's like, stressful, probably not worth it. But if you do, you'll see that the polling margins are really close in the House, but everyone expects the Republicans to win because of the way district lines are drawn. Even if Democrats win a national majority of the popular vote in the House, they probably won't control a majority in the House. So making the Constitution more democratic would mean changing that, would mean getting rid of the Senate, getting rid of the Electoral College. The Senate, by the way, and this is one reason I say a new Constitution as opposed to amending a Constitution, under Article 5, the amendment process for the Constitution, you cannot actually change voting rights in the Senate unless each state agrees. And of course, the small states won't. So that's one reason I say a new constitution is necessary to do these things. Now, again, it sounds crazy. I recognize that. It's not plausible at the moment. But one point I will make in defense of the theory of it is it happened before, a long time ago. In 1787, there was a national document, the Articles of Confederation. It failed. The federal government was not strong enough. There was no executive branch. And the framers believed their task actually in Philadelphia initially was to amend the Articles of Confederation, which required each state to agree. Was impossible, just like what I said about the Senate. So they decided we'll draft a new constitution, because if we don't do it, the country will fall apart.
So let me interrupt just so everybody else gets
Oh, yeah,
a
yeah, that was
chance.
it.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, all right. Thanks. It's a great example. Civil War happened also. So let me because I want Michael to have a chance and Cynthia for a few final remarks. So Michael, you just became a citizen of the United States. How do you feel?
That's funny. I just wanted to say that actually. So I'm probably the most impractical as a historian. We look we look back to the past. But yeah, I will say a few personal words actually. I just became I actually I picked up my green card. I think Trump was in office 4 days, and I became a citizen this year. And so as an immigrant. It's also a specific perspective because I grew up in Germany. My parents were both Holocaust survivors, and it was always the idea, there's Israel and there's America. And at some point, the future for Jews, of course, is not in Germany, and the future of the democratic world is in America. And these were the people. Actually, both my parents were liberated by the Red Army, by Russians. But of course, they would not like, Stalin, although the Red Army did save their life too. Shouldn't forget that. But of course, they looked always to America. And when I came here a long time ago, for the graduate student, 1988. But then I went back and I honestly never, until very recently, could have imagined a scene where I was sitting in front of the TV, as probably most of you, on January 6th. I just had written that book, and I thought that can't be, but it has probably something good to it, because now people will wake up. And I think the worst part of it is what happened after January 6th, until today. And there was this moment, I also had this moment when they had the first discussions and Mitch McConnell spoke, and you had the idea, oh, the Republican party's coming to their senses. And now we have exactly the opposite situation. So I want to just add one thing, not my personal story, but as a historian. I started out as a historian of German Jewry. And I was always asked and I wrote about Weimar Germany, Jews in Weimar Germany. How could the Jews in Weimar Germany be so blind? Why didn't they see the danger? It was written on the wall, because we all know what happened later, but they didn't know the Holocaust would come. How could they know? And I wonder, when should they have seen it? In 1923, when Hitler tried to come to power in a beer hall putsch, and he was not, or in 1924 when he was let free, or in 1930 when the German parliamentary system kind of fell apart, or in 1933 when he was appointed chancellor, or in 1935 when the Nuremberg laws were issued, or in 1938 with Kristallnacht, and I'm thinking we are in the middle of this, as you said, or both of you said, we are now in the middle of it. And it seems, yes, we get upset, but it seems not enough. It seems we just see what is, I think it's very, very frightening what's happening. And we're kind of powerless, because a large part of the population is supporting what's going on. And so what can we do? And I often think that's when people ask, why didn't the Jews in Germany, or the defenders of democracy in Germany, but what should they actually have done in 1930, 1932, in January of 1933? The problem is once democracy has really been backsliding so much that an authoritarian, and you know, Nazi Germany in even in after the passing of the Enable law and other laws, it had the appearance of some democracy, had the appearance of a justice system. And that happened, of course, in more modern times. Yes, you mentioned the book, How Democracies Die. You have all these examples of from Peru to Ecuador to Poland and Hungary. And, you know, honestly, Israel, there is a threat now too. We hear threats to the independent justice system if it will be the most right-wing government, which might be elected, might not be elected. So there's threats all over the world to democracy, not by a beer hall putsch, not by it's by backsliding. And when do we actually recognize this? And what can we do? I mean, and I don't have an answer.
So let's turn to Cynthia because she has some answers.
I'm always the one that's supposed to give hope, so I will try. I will just add, because I want to make sure we have some time for question and other discussions, but that, I was an accidental expert, really. I became an accidental expert in all of this as a German studies scholar myself, as an undergrad, and then doing a dissertation where I happened to be based in working class schools during Germany's first post-unification surge of neo-Nazism and far-right violence. So I was embedded doing ethnography with civics teachers in construction trade schools where some 80% of the young people had shaved heads and bomber jackets and combat boots. And at that time, in the mid to late 90s, Germany started to invest extremely heavily, and they've now put billions and billions of euro, just €1 billion in over the last 3 years alone, into what are now a network of 2,400 prevention programs, specifically targeting right-wing extremism, anti-Semitism, and racism in Germany. So we did a study tour this summer with a group of 11 of us funders and 7 members of our lab to really revisit what's happened over the last 25 years and how are those programs doing. And I think there's a lot to be learned from really the only country that has been making investments in it over the last 25 years, while the rest of the countries across the West that have been facing rising far-right extremism have been focused on international terrorism and really dropped the ball, as our security agencies regularly admit now. As I said, that's not even a controversial thing to say. So, that's not everybody wants to learn from Germany's recent history on that, I think, and I understand that has its own painful past, but I think the investments and the use of a different range of ideas than we've been able to explore here. It's distributed through 12 different agencies, for example, family and culture and labor and education and health and human services, whereas 100% of our prevention resources are distributed through our Department of Homeland Security. So we securitize, we law enforcement, approach it. We see it as a problem to ban and arrest our way out of by reducing content on social media or arresting people instead of investing in education, in social work, and prevention work. And I think that has to change. And I think people understand that has to change now. But like I said, we're very, very only recently seeing that change.
That is the most encouraging thing I've heard, that Germany will be able to teach America how to stop the extremism. So we, first of all, let's thank the panelists before we turn to questions. This has been an extraordinary conversation. So at American University, we always like to give preference for the questions to our students. So this, where is the microphone for oh, okay. So can I see students who would like to ask questions? Raise your hands. Okay, so students who want to ask questions could go over there. And we have some more students over here. Yeah, Sophie, come on. And so just go over there because that's where the microphone is.
Hello, I'm Laura Gomez. I'm one of Cynthia's employees. In looking for parallels between the Weimar period and the current American political situation, we can know historically that Hitler was not the first or founding member of the Nazi Party. So if the idea that the parallel for a new kind of American fascism would come from new blood in MAGAism, what kind of warning signs or indicators should we look for?
Okay, and Sophie, why don't you ask your question and then we'll take the two student questions together. Are there any other students who want to ask? Okay, so we'll do the two student questions together.
To add on to what you guys were saying before, but I guess specifically ask more about fringe groups and these fringe movements, because a lot of what you guys are talking about is these formerly fringe groups and fringe ideas that have been very quickly streamlined into power, and then they've used that power to then undermine democracy. So now, where do you really like draw the line? Because obviously, like if you want to talk from the perspective of protecting democracy, which not everybody comes from, because I think that like a lot of the time in these conversations we come from the perspective that everybody agrees with democracy, but in a lot of cases it's not necessarily an intrinsic value. But back to my point, where do you draw that line, and like how do you tell between when you're actually legitimizing a fringe group by stopping them and when you're doing something that needs to be done before it's turned into a much bigger issue? Like if you look at the birther movement, nobody would have thought that this guy that was running around like a chicken without a head, saying like, where's his birth certificate? Like when was the right time to give that birth certificate? Should they have gone out immediately and said, here it is? That's legitimizing it, but then waiting too long has its own issues. So I guess,
Good.
Well,
I'll let
I'm
the
going to
panel.
answer fantastic questions, both of you. First of all, and I think we are very proud of our students here, and for good reason. I'm going to answer Sophie's question, and I'll leave Laura's question to the historian, the political scientist among us. But I would just say that, and I'm going to answer it maybe with a not totally satisfying response, but to say in practical terms, what we advise, we do a lot of it, work with parents, for example, and teachers, and how do you recognize warning signs? What do you know? Where's the line between hate speech and free speech, right? For example, that's a really, for faculty, that's a really hard one to work on for teachers. And, one of the things we try to help people understand is, especially with young people in your lives, teenagers or others, how you can recognize signs that people are being exposed to propaganda online, right? So the kinds of things that you can hear, and that should open a conversation about what they're hearing. That doesn't mean people are radicalized or that they're members of fringe groups or that they've gone off down a rabbit hole or, but it means that they're consuming information that opens up harmful, potentially harmful gateways to other things. So, for example, like something that we would be concerned about in a class that is non-ideological at all, but that we sometimes hear is, quote, there is no political solution, right? That kind of statement, when you hear that from a young person, first of all, that is a coded call to violence. And second of all, or to revolution, but also that's probably not their own phrase. So if you hear a kid say that who's 15 at the dinner table, where'd you hear that, right? Like, where'd you read that? Tell me about that site, right? Like that to me says that kid's been exposed to some kind of propaganda or something that is opening up a possible gateway. That's the kind of thing that we focus on when we're talking to parents or teachers or coaches or whomever, to be alert to the kind of warning signs. That's not about founded fringe groups or not, but the idea that there's a flow of fringe ideas into the mainstream and back again, that is part of what I think is so dangerous, because it creates openings the way that online spaces work for people to get further and further drawn in.
Laura's question? Michael or?
So I hope I'm getting, tell me if I'm
Hold it up
missing
closer.
something. Oh, sorry. Tell me if I'm missing something. What you made me think of something, but I may be going in a different direction. You mentioned about fascism and about sort of the idea I got was like, maybe it's not just Trump. Is that sort of what you're getting at? Okay. Yeah. I think I heard someone say DeSantis, and of course, yeah. Right, sure. No, you're right. Yes. But before I get to that, which is important, and I appreciate the question and the response, I I mentioned before, Trump's not Hitler, and of course he's not. But I resist. I'm not a political scientist, by the way. I'm a lawyer by background, and my area of study is presidential power under the U.S. Constitution. As I said, I was interested in how it expanded over the years, but only recently was concerned about this authoritarian threat. I resisted the idea that Trump was a fascist. People were saying Trump was a fascist in 2016. I thought, no, he doesn't meet the definition of a fascist. That's overblown. That will distract from you can be an authoritarian without being a fascist. I've come around to the idea that he may be a fascist, or in the words of Federico Finkelstein, is a historian at the New School, and he has a number of books, but the one that I'm thinking of in particular is From Fascism to Populism in History. It's a really interesting book, and so he's a student of fascism, and what he calls Trump and also Bolsonaro and a few others around the world, Erdogan and Putin, he calls them wannabe fascists. And I think that's a useful term because it conveys this idea that Donald Trump is not Hitler, right? In part because January 6th didn't succeed. It didn't succeed for Hitler either in 1923, but eventually he came to power. Trump has not, at least as of yet. But he has fascist ambitions. What Finkelstein means by this, and that's why I appreciate you asking your question. I meant to say this before. What Finkelstein means is that they're warning signs. Fascists, unlike populists, which is how Trump was described at first, fascists use violence against their opponents who they describe as enemies. Fascists seek to destroy democracy, to set up a dictatorship. Fascists seek to militarize society, and fascists use propaganda in a different way than other politicians. The kind of big lie that Michael was talking about before, like whether it's the stab in the back lie after World War I or the stolen election lie now. So all those warning signs are there with Trump. So yes, I think now it is, to me, I think it's appropriate to talk about the risk of fascism, which doesn't mean it has to happen. It means there are warning signs. And it absolutely, as you point out too, it doesn't mean it's limited to Trump. I think Cynthia made this point before. Yeah, you were saying this has been building over a number of years. Of course, Trump didn't make all this. Trump was both an accelerant and a symptom. But if Donald Trump leaves the political scene, this threat does not go away. It's there and it has to be dealt with, and hopefully can be. So, and yes, I think there are others. DeSantis in Florida certainly seems to be positioning himself. I think he's hoping that there's a chance for him to run for president, and he's doing. Florida, for instance, is one of, I think, 2 states as one of these so-called don't say gay bills that really pernicious, and it fits into this idea I mentioned before, scapegoating a very, very small minority. So I think he's someone to watch and be aware of, certainly, partly because just like Trump could say he's not Hitler, DeSantis can say I'm not Trump. That was something I remember writing a piece about this in 2016 when I thought maybe Trump won't get that nomination, but if he doesn't, then everyone else, whether it's Ted Cruz or Rubio, whoever else was running at the time, I don't remember all of them. I think Gingrich at one point, is that right? I don't remember, but they will all be able to say, we're not Trump. You might think he's crazy. We're not. I think DeSantis could do the same thing now, but I think the threat is there. I think your question is the right one to ask. This can't go away immediately, unfortunately.
So do we have questions from the audience? So over there and there and there. I can just give you the microphone on this end. So if you want to go over there to line up, and no, we need the microphone
Zoom,
because we have on Zoom. Okay. Oh yeah, please talk into the mic. Okay, Helen. Okay.
One other aspect that always.
No, it's like the mic died. Okay, now good. We're good.
All right. One other aspect of this that hasn't been mentioned, but it's there. Years ago, before I moved to Washington, I was involved with the Jewish Studies program in another university, and we brought an exhibit that was presented by the German consulate in the South of the change in the legal system in Germany in 1930s. And the emphasis was one of the first things that the Nazis did when they came to power was to totally change the legal system. They got rid of Jewish lawyers, of course, but also enough laws were changed so that enabled them to do things that were now legal. And that's one very major institution, and I see hints of it in the way the Supreme Court has been hacked, and the way the judicial system in general, the federal judicial system, has been hacked with Trump followers and so forth. Now, luckily, so far, there have been enough, even Republican people in these courts that are, if not standing up, at least not going along with everything. But that's a major institution. That was the first thing to go. Secondly, Hitler was able to co-opt many of the major industries. And perhaps most important, finally, the military. And I think if anything so far in this country, with the exception of Michael Flynn, mostly the military stood firm. These are some of the institutions, but not the only ones. The State Department's been emptied out, the education departments across the board. There was so much damage done by people quitting because they couldn't handle it or being fired and so forth. So that the basic instruments of government has been hollowed out, giving the opportunity for a new regime. And I'd like some comments about how we get around, how we go back to some normality.
So we're going to take this question. We're going to take a question over here, and then the panel will comment. Did you want to ask your question? Into the mic.
2 points. One, on the question of a new constitution, be careful what you ask for or wish for. We will not have a Bill of Rights. We will not have a lot of the institutions that we now have that are minor protections as they seem to be the last 3 years or so. And Cynthia, you were talking about going back 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. America has a history of anti-Semitism going back to Father Coughlin in the 30s, going back to the Populist Party in the late 19th century. This is not an issue. I mean, I think you're thinking the right things, but I don't hate too hopeful of the short term of resolving any of these issues.
All right, and
thank you. One question for Cynthia and one question about the Constitution. You mentioned the efforts by Germany to use education. Have you studied the link, or is there any linkage between the decline in the United States public schools of civics teaching and the more susceptibility of the young people to propaganda? And my own recollection is that sort of coincided with the emphasis on STEM after it was discovered that the United States was falling behind Korea, China, and other countries in the Pacific in math and sciences. So that's that question. Well, sure.
okay, thanks. All right, so I'm going to let you answer the questions, and then we're going to take a few questions from online. Oh, you don't? All right. Okay. Keep going.
Microphone's on. I would just say very quickly, yes, absolutely. There is a long history, also massive, of course, Ku Klux Klan, multiple waves of growth of that, both after slavery and, I mean, the history of slavery, Native American history, there's a huge history, anti-Semitism. But at the same time, there's something different in the last, since around 2010, in the numbers of hate groups in the recorded history recently, and in the use of social media and online platforms that has transformed the way that people encounter it, I think, which is important to document. So that's really my point, but absolutely well taken point. On the education issue, yes, I very much think, although there's not research documenting the connection, but very well, but absolutely, as I've been a professor of education my entire career, and so I can say that, we have tracked this shift, not just to an emphasis on STEM, but to a shift in testing regimes, which tie teacher merit pay to school test scores, student test scores, which have emphasized then things that are assessed, which are really literacy, writing and grammar and math, right? So I think that's absolutely true. And the last thing I'll say about that with Germany is that one of the really interesting things about the education model there is in the post-war era, they set up a federal agency for public civic education that is separate from the federal agency for education, right? So you have an education ministry, but you also have an agency for civic education, which is to educate the public about democracy and to prevent propaganda from people from being persuaded by propaganda. And I think that's really important that there's a public facing agency. It sounds crazy to create a whole new agency, except we did create a whole new agency after 9/11, which is the Department of Homeland Security. Like we've seen that in other crises. And we mobilized that one in just 15 months. We're already well over 15 months past 1/6, and we're not seeing that same kind of energy. So I would like to see an agency that is around civic literacy, at least a massive agency level initiative around education, civic education, but we're not seeing that kind of bipartisan support yet.
Reflections, Michael?
There is this on this topic. There is the recent book by Susan Neiman called "Learning from the Germans." But then you think, of course, well, look what had to happen in Germany first. And I agree very much. I can't stress enough. Of course, Trump is not Hitler, and of course, we would be foolish to make this comparison. But at the same time, like Hitler, and like so many other people who are not Hitler in today's Poland and Hungary and and Nicaragua and many other people, who he is somebody who is dangerous for democracy. And I think there are other, of course, I just want to say there are other differences which we shouldn't forget. I mean, Germany was a very new democracy. America is not a new democracy, and there's a big difference, of course, and that is social media, and the social media, and with it a social polarization that I think is also not existent in the Germany of the 20s, or maybe even any other society. When you have election results like in Washington, D.C., where I think Democrats get like 94%, and other places where Republicans get over 90%. I don't think in most democratic countries you have a city, one city, any city, where one party gets over 90% of the votes. It shows just that, like in this room, I don't know, but I assume somehow we're in DC, we're at American University. We're kind of sharing a certain, main line in political thought. And that is something which makes it so hard to get to the other side. And the last thing, I'm definitely not an expert on the Constitution, I'll leave that to you, but as somebody who grew up somewhere else, I think Americans often don't realize how unique this case is. I don't think there is any other country in the world that has a constitution that's even close to being over 200 years old. Britain doesn't have a written constitution. France, I think, since the revolution, has had probably 5 constitutions. Germany also. And most countries just rewrite their constitutions. And it's amazing how in America, it's like the Bible. It's God's word. I mean, I shouldn't say this. My wife is a lawyer and teaches here, and she tells me how difficult it is, as you say, and impossible to. But if you are in any other place in the world, you think, well, it's a constitution, and the constitution maybe should even be reconsidered, because we don't live in the 18th century. Yes, there were amendments, and there are amendments, but the last one is a long time ago. I had to learn all this for my citizenship test. But
You did well.
but it's not. It's exceptional, I think, and you know this better. But as a historian, I would say this is an exception. But most people assume it's like, we have to, and the now. Well, I don't go into this, but you're right. It's not realistic to think about it, but it shows you, just as so many other areas, how different America is from the rest also of the Western world. I'm not talking about death penalty and guns and other things, but the Constitution.
Well, that's actually an amazing place to end because it's quite hopeful, maybe the most hopeful thing that we've heard all night. So please join me in thanking the panel. Well done.